So I actually have played through the game with every single holy weapon from start to finish. Now I have done this on stream as part of a challenge run, only using certain types of attacks or skills, and it's safe to say that holy damage is straight up doo-doo trash. I've been saying this since the release of the game, and I'll continue to say it even now. Now that's not to say that some of these weapons are not that good, because there are plenty of amazing holy weapons. It's just objectively they'll be better if they just were not holy damage. But for today, I am going to rank all 30 of them from worst to best. Now this is just going to be a PvE list. But before I do get started though, I do want to give a quick shout out to my boy, Steven the Omen, my test dummy. It's been like a year and a half since this guy's actually made the debut on my channel, and I've actually haven't given him a single shout out. So in the comments, just give him some love, because it's going to be a pretty rough month for this guy, because I'm going to be doing videos like this for every single damage type, and he's just not going to have a great experience. So just share a little bit of love. Anyway, let's get started. Now, starting off the list right at the bottom in the D tier, we have the Gargoyle Black Halberd. And honestly, I might as well throw in the Gargoyle Black Blades and the Gargoyle Black Axe at 29 and number 28 as well, because they're all the exact same version of doo-doo trash, basically, because they just serve zero purpose in this game. Let's just start off with the fact that they all have horrendous range, like just really bad range. They also have terrible requirements. They get insanely high faith requirements, all get descalings in faith, and not a single one of them actually gets a unique weapon skill or a destined death effect, any type of damage over time effect. It gets none of that. So basically, you're just better off using the regular Gargoyle weapons and infuse it, because it'll just end up being 10 times better as well. So yeah, these things are just useless. Number 27, we have the Eclipse Shotel. Now this is actually going to be a curved sword that does work the same way as the other Shotels do, in that it has terrible range, terrible damage, but its trade-off being is that it can hit around shields, which is a terrible trade-off because there aren't many shielded enemies in this game. But this thing is actually going to be more of a PvP-based option, even though it does suck in PvP too. But that's the reason as to why it's going to get lower on a PvE-based list, is because its weapon skill, Death Flare, adds more Death Blight to the weapon itself, and Death Blight doesn't work in PvP. Don't know why. Please, FromSoft, just trying to make it work to some capacity in PvE. That would be nice. But it actually does get a follow-up input as well for another additional 16 FP. It does like a small little AoE attack that does terrible damage. You're just not really worth using at all. But yeah, it's just going to get lower on the list because it kind of just sucks in general. At number 26, we have the Staff of the Avatar. Now, this is actually a colossal weapon that does actually have decent range. It gets good scalings, an A scaling in strength and a B scaling in faith. Unfortunately, it's a colossal weapon, so its moveset is going to kind of suck. And its weapon skill, Erdtree Slam, is just like Golden Slam, but just worse, because Golden Slam can do more damage. You can actually put that on any type of weapon. And Golden Slam does actually have more stance damage as well. It does 46 stance damage, whereas Erdtree Slam only does 36 stance damage. So it just doesn't have any purpose. I don't really know. It does consume a little bit less FP, but it's not that much difference to actually have it be worth using. So yeah, it's just going to get lower on the list. Number 25, we have the Golden Epitaph. Now, this weapon looks cool, and that's just about it. It's just a basic straight sword that gets average damage, average range, and its weapon skill, Last Rites, doesn't really serve much of a purpose because it is very similar to the Shared Order weapon skill, but it actually is a slightly better version because it actually does do more damage to undead type enemies, which is actually the only purpose that Shared Order actually has to begin with. So basically, the only purpose of this weapon is to actually use the weapon skill Last Rites, which is an aura buff, to just make you do more damage against skeletons and undead enemies. So if you just want to outright kill skeletons for whatever reason, if you're actually having a problem killing them in the first place, but I guess the main purpose is to kill the Deathrite birds, so it actually just does more damage to them when you use its weapon skill, but it is just an aura buff, so it's not going to stack with things like Golden Vow as well, so it's like a very, very niche use, so I wouldn't really bother using the weapon itself. I'll just use it for the buff and then switch back to your main weapon. Number 24, we have the Miquellan Night Sword. Now, this is another holy-based straight sword that also gets terrible scalings. It gets descaling in strength, dexterity, and faith at plus 10, by the way. All of it descalings. Why? Who thought of this? I don't understand. Anyway, but also, it just gets a very basic weapon skill in Sacred Blade, which is not even unique. You can just put Sacred Blade on literally any type of straight sword, and it'll pretty much do the exact same thing. But the reason as to why this gets a little bit higher than some of the other options is because its heavy attack is actually somewhat unique, and it actually is pretty cool. You can fully charge it. It is a nice lunge as well. You can just tap it. Actually comes out relatively quick as well. I think it's a decent heavy attack, hence why it actually gets number 24, but it still is a very mid option. Number 23, we have the Inseparable Sword. Now, just like the Miquellan Night Sword, this weapon does look very cool, does get a cool moveset, but it just gets Sacred Blade, and its moveset itself is not even that unique because it's actually the exact same moveset as a Night Sword and a Banished Night Sword, so you're better off just putting Sacred Blade onto that, and it'll pretty much be the exact same thing, probably even better, actually. but the reason I'm still going to put it above the Miquellan Knight Sword is because at least it gets a B scaling in Faith, and Sacred Blade scales of Faith, so you're just going to do more damage with Sacred Blade when you use the Inseparable Sword. But yeah, both of them are still the C tier options. Not really much point to using, other than just having like a quick, easy to use Sombra based weapon. Number 22, we have the Blade of Calling. Now, this is actually a pretty cool weapon. Gets a cool heavy attack, gets a really cool weapon skill. For only 17 FP, you can do this cool projectile attack that sends enemies flying. However, this dagger is just directly outclassed by the Black Knife Dagger, which also gets the exact same cool heavy attack, same crit damage, arguably just gets a better scaling as well, and the exact same reskinned version of its weapon skill. However, it just does way more damage, and it does percentile damage over time as well, so it can just shred a whole bunch of enemies and cheese the game very quickly, as you probably end up getting into. But the difference being is that this one actually does have knockback damage, so it can actually send enemies flying, and it consumes a little bit less FP, but it's still not worth using over the Black Knife, because even the stance damage is exactly the same. If it actually had more stance damage, or like buffed the weapon or debuffed an enemy, it would have a lot more utility, but I just don't see much of a purpose of this weapon actually existing, especially because you get it after the weapon itself, so I don't really know. Now, getting into the B tier, at number 21, we have the Golden Halberd. Now, this is a very popular weapon amongst speedrunners and beginners because you can get it right at the beginning of the game, and this weapon actually does have some decent base damage. However, it just has the very basic Halberd moveset, and it gets pretty average range, and its weapon skill is just Golden Bow, which you can get Golden Bow right at the beginning of the game at Limgrave as well, and you can just throw that onto a dagger, and being that Ashes of War don't have any requirements, you can just benefit the exact same way. And in terms of damage, you could actually use things like the Guardian Sword Spear or the Knight Rider's Glaive, because they will just end up doing more damage, and you can infuse them with any weapon skill you want, so you can just have a better weapon skill, basically. So yeah, this thing doesn't really have much of a use. At number 20, we have the Golden Order Greatsword. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this weapon because I just talked about it recently on my 10 weapons that need to get buffed. Because yes, this thing is just very disappointing. It should be way better than what it is right now. Should it be exactly like the Moonlight Greatsword, but just the holy version of that. Because its weapon skill is really cool, but it takes forever to get to that projectile part, consumes way too much FP, its scalings are completely off, it gets a descaling in dexterity, but it gets a 21 dexterity requirement, doesn't even do that good of damage as well, its poise damage should be a bit better as well, it's just so upsetting, it should be so much better. Number 19, we have the Cipher Pata. Now, this is actually a fist-based weapon with a cool poking attack moveset, and actually has pure holy damage and a pure faith scaling, so it's pretty much exactly like the Coated Sword, but a fist-based version. And with this moveset, I actually prefer it a little bit more than the Coated Sword. However, when using these weapons, you'll tend to pair it alongside a spellcasting build. So when using a spellcasting build, you kind of want to have a hand free for your seal, and when using a fist weapon, you kind of have to have it two-handed, so it kind of just gets in the way of your spellcasting. Hence why I'd probably prefer the Coated Sword a little bit more. And this weapon's skill, Unblockable Blade, is pretty much just like Impaling Thrust, but it consumes 17 FP. And that is kind of unique because Impaling Thrust can't be infused onto fist-based weapons, so that is kind of cool. But it actually doesn't even extend the weapon. At least with a Coated Sword, when you use its weapon skill, it actually extends the weapon. But this one doesn't really do that, so there's so many times you just fall short. If it extended the weapon itself when actually using it, I would actually probably prefer it a lot more, but unfortunately can't really get anything higher than the B tier. Number 18, we have the Winged Scythe. Now, this is obviously a scythe, gets a C scaling in both dexterity and faith, and it is going to be more of a PvP-based weapon because its weapon skill, Angel Wings, does actually stop enemies from healing, which is obviously going to be more of a PvP-based poke, and it is guaranteed in PvP. But the reason as to why I don't really care for it much in PvE is because its weapon skill is pretty much identical to Loretta's Slash, but Loretta's Slash, you can just infuse it onto many different types of weapons and just arguably just do way more damage than you ever could with the Winged Scythe, and probably just, just not do holy damage as well, which is obviously always better. But it actually does do blood loss build up as well, which is kind of cool. But yeah, being that it's not really that unique and not really much of a PvE based weapon, it can't really get anything higher than this. Number 17, we have the Great Club. Now, this is a colossal weapon that does actually get a lot more physical damage compared to its holy damage. It only gets a descaling in faith, but thankfully it doesn't actually get a faith-based requirement, which is very handy. Now, the best things about this weapon is that you have a pretty unique heavy attack, which has like a pretty quick downward slam. It's not my favorite colossal weapon heavy attack. I probably prefer the Giant Crusher a little bit more. But this actually can be buffed as well, on top of the fact that you obviously do have that split holy damage, which is very unique. However, its weapon skill is just Golden Land, which is not a unique weapon skill. You can just put that onto a bunch of different other weapons, so unfortunately that is going to hurt the potential of this weapon. It'd be a lot better if you could just infuse it, but unfortunately that is not the case, so it can only get number 17. Number 16, we have the Treespear. Now, this is exactly like the Great Club, but just in a Greatspear version, hence me preferring it a little bit more because Greatspears tend to just be the better weapon class due to their movesets. Now, the reason as to why it's the same is because you can buff it. You actually do have that split holy damage, do have a unique heavy attack, but you just get stuck with a non-unique weapon skill. Now this one's weapon skill is Sacred Order, which is probably like the last thing that I like to have on this weapon, because Sacred Order is a weapon buff, and the fact that you can buff it just counteracts one another, so having Sacred Order is just made redundant with this weapon. But its heavy attack, when fully charged, is a cool little double poke, and it can do a whole bunch of damage. So pairing it alongside a heavy attack build is definitely the play, and it's not too bad, but it definitely should actually have a unique weapon skill. Number 15, we have the Envoy's Greathorn. Now this is another colossal weapon that does actually summon this big giant bubble with its weapon skill called Great Oracle Bubble for 16 FP. Does actually go relatively far, can actually stagger pretty well, does some okay damage. However, its weapon skill scales off Faith, and it gets a descaling in Faith. I'm sick of weapons when they have descalings in the stat of which they scale off. It's incredibly annoying, but the reason as to why I probably have it a bit lower on the list for the main reason is that Envoy's Longhorn exists, and it's pretty much better in almost every single way. The only benefit that Envoy's Greathorn has is that it can go a little bit further and has some more tracking, but Envoy's Longhorn does way more stance damage, way more total overall damage, and it's not even close. And it's a Great Hammer, which is a much better weapon class, and that actually gets a B scaling in Faith as well. So just this thing doesn't have much of a purpose. If it just probably did a bit more stance damage, or like actually, you know, spit out multiple at the same time, I don't know. But the fact that Envoy's Longhorn exists just kind of makes this weapon redundant. Now getting into the A tier, at number 14, we have the Cleanrot Spear. Now this weapon actually definitely did surprise me when playing through with it, because I thought it was going to be trash, and it really wasn't. It actually is a pretty decent skill. Now unfortunately, just like the Envoy's Greathorn, gets a descaling in Faith, and its weapon skill purely scales off Faith. It's highly annoying. However, its skill Sacred Phalanx for 12 FP, you can do a decent chunk of damage, and its FP to damage ratio is one of the highest in the entire game. It's really just that good. Now, there are a couple of things about the weapon skill of which I don't really care much about, and that's one, doesn't get much hyper armor, and it is a short-ranged type of skill, so it would benefit greatly if it did have some more, and it is more of a delayed effect when those spears come out of the ground, so if it came out a little bit quicker, that would be nice too. But this weapon actually does get a pretty cool heavy attack. The exact same one as the short spear, gets a cool little double poke, so when fully charged, you actually can get some decent amount of damage, but yeah, overall, I can get an A tier. Number 13, we have the Coated Sword. Now, this is a straight sword that works very similar to the Cipher Pata of which I just talked about, in that it gets pure holy damage and a pure faith scaling. So it's very nice when actually using with spell casting builds. If you're just going to go with a pure caster, but you just wanted to have some type of weapon option, this is probably going to be your best bet. You can just throw it in one hand, have your seal on the other, and its benefit that way. Now, its damage is not going to be like the greatest thing in the world, because it is just pure holy damage as well. But its weapon skill is pretty nice, doesn't consume that much FP, does a decent amount of damage, has some nice range. It can poise break relatively quickly as well, so it's just overall a solid option, but it's not like the greatest thing in the world. At number 12, we have the Envoy's Horn. Now, this is actually going to be the smallest out of all of the Dooting bubbles, in that it is a hammer that does actually get a C scaling in all strength, dexterity, and faith, which is actually very nice. Also gets more physical damage compared to holy damage, which is also very cool because it complements its weapon skill, Oracle Bubble, which for 6 FP, you just do pure holy damage in a form of a small little bubble. You can cast it over and over again to get relatively quick recovery animations as well. It's just a nice projectile that goes relatively far, has some very good tracking, and projectiles in this game just perform extremely well. Now, the reason as to why this one doesn't get a bit higher on the list is because it's pure holy damage, and against those bosses that are a lot more resist to holy, it just does not perform that well at all. What I did wish is actually if there was like a charged version of this weapon skill to actually do more poise damage and more total overall damage, I'd probably put it a little bit higher, but it still is a pretty decent weapon, has a good projectile, definitely recommend using it. At number 11, we have the Gargoyle's Blackblade. Now, this weapon is a greatsword, and it is the last of the Gargoyle Black weapons, and it is the only one that has a unique weapon skill. However, its weapon skill is just a reskinned version of Vacuum Slice, which is just directly outclassed by the Blasphemous Blade weapon skill Taker's Flame, which is also a greatsword that just gets better scalings and better requirements, and it is split fire damage, which is better than holy damage, and that weapon skill just goes a lot further, goes through enemies, does heal you as well. But that's not to say that this weapon is actually useless, hence why it gets number 11, is because its weapon skill does consume half the amount of FP, and it actually has a damage over time effect as well. So it actually can do more damage than the Blasphemous Blade at half the amount of FP. Now, yes, it's not going to go as far, but if you just did want to have a damage over time effect, it is pretty handy. It is still a projectile, so it can still cheese the entire game. So if you actually did want to use something like the Blasphemous Blade, but not want to use a Blasphemous Blade because you don't want to cheese the game, this is probably a good alternative, because it still is pretty decent, but the fact that Blasphemous Blade exists means that this is not going to really get much higher on the list. At number 10, we have the Beastclaw Greathammer. Now, this weapon actually is a lot more physical damage compared to its holy damage, and its weapon skill just does pure physical as well. So when using it, I just recommend going all into strength and dexterity. It just performs a lot better that way. but its skill is kind of similar to the Gargoyle's Blackblade in that it shoots out these like projectiles, but it shoots out 5 of them in a horizontal spread, so it's actually better against enemies that like to input read and dodge. However, it doesn't really go that far, which is probably its main drawback. But for 20 FP and how much damage it actually does do, and the fact that it's pure physical, it is pretty nice. But if the casting speed was a little bit faster or the projectile just went further, I'd probably end up liking it a lot more. At number 9, we have the Ornamental Straight Sword. Now, this weapon only gets holy damage after you use its weapon skill, but other than that, it just gets pure physical and it gets a pure dexterity scaling on top of that, which can be a good and a bad thing. It means it's very good at regular new game, but once you get to like later new game playthroughs, it doesn't really perform that well in terms of total overall damage. But this weapon is very unique in that when you two-hand it, you do the power stance combo, and the power stance combo with straight swords is extremely good, and it is just the extended version of that. So you actually get a unique running heavy attack, and you get unique jumping attacks as well. But the best thing about this weapon is its skill Golden Tempering. For 24 FP, you actually just buff your weapon with 100 holy damage, and it changes up your heavy attacks to just be insane. Like you just tap it one time, you can do this insane upward cut that comes out very fast, does insane damage, or you can fully charge it to do this like crazy barrage of thrusting attacks, and that actually ends in doing that same upward cut as well. And if you pair this alongside the multi-hit talismans, the axe talisman, and even the jellyfish shield, because it actually has unique synergy with that, after you use the buff, you can actually still use the heavy attack and it would automatically two-hand and still retain the buff as well. You can just do a whole bunch of damage. It can poise break very quickly because it is a heavy attack, and you do get 110 crit as well. So after you get the poise break, you can just do even more critical damage now. So yeah, it's definitely one of the better weapons in the entire game. At number 8, we have the Maliketh's Blackblade. Now, this is a colossal sword that does get pretty decent scalings. It gets a B scaling in strength and faith, and its weapon skill, which is Destined Death, just shreds a whole bunch of enemies. Now, obviously, it does that Destined Death damage over time effect, and actually cuts their health by 10% as well. And when you do connect with it, it just melts everything in the entire game. Doesn't matter if they're holy resist or not. But the downsides to this skill is that it consumes 40 FP, and it actually is a very long animation as well, to the point where enemies can just like wail on you while you're using it, and you have to trade out basically. Sometimes enemies can even stagger you out of it, and it'll just waste your FP as well, which is not very good, but once you do land and connect with it, it can be a very powerful weapon. Now, getting into the S tier, at number 7, we have the Black Knife. Now, this is a dagger, which I don't really care for much to have as a primary option. I always like daggers as a secondary option, but this thing is very similar to the Blade of Calling, of which I just talked about, in that its heavy attacks are the exact same crit damage, very similar scalings, and its weapon skill is the exact same animation, but this one just does a lot more damage because it has that same Destined Death damage over time effect as Maliketh's Blackblade. But I just prefer it a bit more because you can use it at a distance, and it only consumes 25 FP, and you get like infinite hyper armor as well when using it. But yeah, projectile attacks just cheese the entire game, and the fact that this thing just does damage over time on top of that, it's just going to be one of the better weapons. At number 6, we have the Marika's Hammer. Now, this weapon surprised me a whole bunch when I actually used it. The skill itself, I thought it was actually going to be trash and actually scale purely off faith and just do holy damage, but it actually scales off your AR, which actually mainly does physical damage, and the fact that this thing gets a B scaling in strength, you can just go all into strength and just fuck up a whole bunch of enemies that way. Because its weapon skill, a Gold Breaker, for 26 FP, you can just jump into the air, get like infinite hyper armor, never get staggered, come crashing to the ground, do a massive AoE that like yeets enemies up into the air, does insane damage, and you can stance break extremely quickly as well. So yeah, I'm definitely proud to say that the Marika's Hammer is an S tier weapon. At number 5, we have the Halo Scythe. Now, this weapon is another weapon that gets a D scaling in faith, and its weapon skill scales off faith, which is annoying, but the weapon skill is absolutely built different. Now, this thing is very similar to the Sacred Ring of Light weapon skill, but just the much better version because it just does more damage, it actually staggers, and it goes a lot further as well. But for 11 FP, you can just spam it over and over again, and it's do a whole bunch of damage that way. And after you use it, the inputs, it actually has a little delayed effect, so enemies will actually dodge it if they do want to input read, and they'll still get hit by it, so it's good against enemies like to dodge and input read. It goes very far, and obviously projectiles are just built different in this game because it just trivializes everything, and it's a scythe, so it gets a decent moveset, and you actually do get bloodlust build up on top of that as well, so yeah, it's definitely deserving of the number 5 spot. Number 4, Siluria's Tree, more projectile-based weapons, who would have guessed, but this thing is a Greatspear that gets a B scaling in strength and a C scaling in faith, which is very nice, and its weapon skill actually scales off AR, despite it actually being a projectile as well. So you can just go into a bunch of strength if you actually just wanted to do mainly physical damage and just work that way. But its weapon skill, Siluria's Woe, for 25 FP, you can either tap it and do like a little short range AoE attack that can do some decent damage, decent poise damage as well. Or you can fully charge it, which turns it into a projectile that just goes through enemies, goes extremely far, does a fuck ton of damage. You can pair it alongside the Godfrey's icon to make it do even more damage as well. It does 27 stance damage on top of that, which is just really good for a projectile as well. So yeah, it's just built different. And this thing actually does get a unique heavy attack, gets a cool horizontal swipe, which is nice for the great spears because they only tend to get poking attacks. So it even gets good variety in that regard. So yeah, definitely deserving of the number 4 spot. Number 3, the Sacred Relic Sword. Now, out of all the weapons that I played through the game with, this one is the one that surprised me the most. I thought this thing was just like a glorified rune farming machine, but no. It's actually built different. This thing is actually insane. Like, I don't know what I was thinking, but like it just covers the entire room and just hits everything. Doesn't matter what happens. They're just gonna get hit. It just does a decent amount of damage as well. I thought it was gonna be like mid damage, but no, it's actually good. Now, the downside is that it does consume 42 FP, but I like to pair it alongside things like the Carrying Feelygood Crest and the Ash of War Scarab to actually decrease it to 27 FP. But honestly, I never had like an easier experience in the game than just spamming this weapon skill over and over again. Just sitting at the back of the map and just having the grand old time of just spamming the skill. Now, if you do go up against enemies that are resist to holy damage, you can just use the weapon itself because it actually mainly does physical damage. And if you just spam heavy attacks, get the poise break, get the riposte because this thing does a 110 crit multiplier as well. And it gets decent scaling, to get a B scaling and dexterity and a C scaling and faith. So yeah, overall, it's just a very solid weapon. At number 2, we have the Ordovis' Greatsword. Now, honestly, I was kind of second guessing my decision to put it at number 2 because there's no projectile attack, so it can't cheese the game. But it still does because it's just built different. But basically what's going on here is that this is a physical type weapon, gets an A scaling in strength, a C scaling in faith, but its weapon skill scales of AR. So you can just go all into strength. Don't even worry about the holy damage this thing does because it's just not even an issue. But for 15 FP, its weapon skill Ordovis' Vortex, you can just tap it, come out very quick, get good hyper armor, does decent damage, does actually 30 stance damage as well. Or you can fully charge it, pair it alongside the Godfrey's icon, do absolutely insane damage, and 82 stance damage. 82? That's fucking insane. It just shreds everything and its posture breaks them extremely quickly. It's just like, it's unheard of. I don't understand why. How does this even thing come to pass? It's just absolutely insane. I don't know why more people aren't using this thing, but 82 stance damage when fully charged for 15 FP, all the hyper armor in the world? Bro. Number 1, we have the Envoy's Longhorn. Now this bad boy right here. Oh my god. Okay, so it gets a B scaling in faith. Gets a C scaling in strength. It's a great hammer, so it has a decent moveset. Gets really good poise damage as well. Does strike damage, which is nice, even against Radagon, which obviously holy damage normally is bad against him, but it actually mainly does physical damage with this weapon. But the best part about it is its weapon skill, Bubble Shower, which for 16 FP, you get down on the ground and you just summon a bunch of these bubbles. Now it is like a longer animation. You do get a little bit of hyper armor, but the damage is just out of this world. Like, it is actually fucking insane. Like, I don't understand how this can even come to pass. Now, you might see like, okay, it's only good against larger types of bosses, but no, not even just large bosses. Even against like smaller enemies, it still fucks them up too. It just does insane damage. And even against like large bosses that are resist to holy, like the Elden Beast, 80% resist to holy. And look at the damage. How is it doing this much damage? It's pure holy damage, but against a boss that's 80% resist, it does that much. And as I was talking about with the Ordovis' Greatsword, we're talking about 82 stance damage being a lot. If every bubble hits, you do 92 stance damage. 92 stance damage! What? It gets everything. How? How did this thing come to pass too? I don't understand. This thing is the definitive best holy weapon in the entire game, bar none. I don't care what anybody says. The gameplay should just speak for itself. It's just that good. Number 1, put it to rest. Anyway, that is that. We're done. That is the entire list. I might do the fire-based weapons next, or the magic ones. I don't know. Let me know down in the comments which ones I should actually rank next. As always, please do like and subscribe, and do follow me on Twitch, because actually, by the time this video is out, I should be doing my Souls marathon. We'll be playing through all the Souls games again, so definitely check me out there. But yeah, that's the way. See you next one, guys. Bye!